The final call for Aeroflot Soviet Airlines, flight number SU-244 to Moscow. Passengers to Moscow. This is the final call for Aeroflot Soviet Airlines, flight number SU-244. Passengers only on this flight should go immediately through the departure doors.
At London's Heathrow Airport, someone somewhere has got a list. On it, 90 names, Russians, men and women, with a choice of 7 Aeroflot flights before the deadline for their departure tomorrow week. Drastic action, as everyone now concedes, but every single person ordered to fly back to Moscow is considered by the security services of this country to have had some part in activities organized by the Russian intelligence service. The Foreign Office even took the unusual step of publishing letters from Sir Alec Douglas-Home to his Russian equivalent, Mr. Gromyko, letters written over a period of almost a year. They complained about espionage on a massive scale, and Sir Alec drew Mr. Gromyko's attention in particular to what he called the totally inadmissible activities of members of the Soviet trade delegation. At their headquarters in Highgate, the men behind the spies, the organization men if you like, work away with little contact with the embassy itself. The reason these men had to go was simply that their organization had outgrown the resources of our organization, whose job it was to deal with them. The whole thing was obviously brought forward by the defection at the beginning of August of a senior KGB official, now named as Oleg Lialin. His information made it plain that something had to be done, and when people began to look at the facts, there was plenty to go on. There is no doubt that the KGB, living as they do most of them clustered round their Highgate headquarters, there's no doubt that they were taking advantage of life as it is at present in this country. It's much easier for official embassy staff to operate in Britain than, for example, in the hostile environment of the United States, with its general anti-leftist attitudes. Overall, Russians living in this country can function legally in areas that would be judged quite illegal anywhere else. Their representatives are spread across the country, mostly in firms conducting entirely legitimate business. We put the published accounts of a dozen of them to an auditor. He couldn't fault them in any way. But at the same time, staffs on these firms have been growing. Not all of them are on strictly legitimate business. When the Russians need to get someone into the country undercover, what better than to announce that the managing director of such and such a firm had to go back to Moscow for family reasons, and in his place would come a replacement. But apart from that, despite some reports in the press, we could find no evidence that Russian firms were used for anything but legitimate business. Not, of course, that the operation in the last week was aimed at the firms anyway. Its target was the official mission, the trade delegation and the embassy. Many of the 90 people named in the list were, of course, immediately suspect. One section of the security services has the task of scanning the world's diplomatic lists, tracking the movements of known agents around the diplomatic circuit. Other information comes from defectors. In its search, the KGB fans out through the country, often using local Communist Party as talent spotters. Genuine ideological sympathizers make the best agents, but the Russians are always ready to use the straight bribe, trusting in what they consider to be the universal venality of capitalist man. The embassy also works on occasions, it's thought, through groups that exist to further the social, cultural and trading ties with Russia. One of the larger of these organizations is the British-Soviet Friendship Society. Its membership is uncertain. Its aims are just as its title states. And it is, says its secretary, Mrs. Pearl Lilly, a non-party political organization. But just what are its connections with the Soviet authorities?
We only have connections with the Soviet embassy to the degree that our work takes us in contact with them. For instance, we work very closely with town twins, and when delegations are coming, to the degree that that delegation is in contact with some particular official in the embassy, then we would meet up with an official from the Soviet embassy, or maybe to the consulate when one is arranging delegations. One goes to the Soviet consulate to take passports, visa forms, and so on.
But does the Soviet embassy or the trade delegation have any influence at all on you, or any financial control over you?
Certainly not. We don't have such a thing as Moscow Gold. We'd be a much richer organisation if we had, but we don't. We rely entirely on the British public, and we want to emphasise that we are a British organisation. We are made up of British people. We have many thousands of affiliated people to us through bodies which affiliate to our organisation, and we rely entirely on donations and subscriptions to our organisation.
Is it possible, you say donations and subscriptions, that any of the donations and subscriptions, without you realising it, could be, as you described it, Soviet gold?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. They don't come in any large quantities. Our money comes in small quantities from people who we know. We know our English friends. Certainly not.
Would it be possible, do you think, for your organisation or similar organisations to be used, without you realising it, by the Soviet authorities, the embassy or any of their other organisations here, to indulge in espionage, spying, propaganda, the sort of activity that would be regarded by the Foreign Office as being anti-British?
Certainly not.
Stowers Johnson gave up the editorship of an Anglo-Soviet friendship journal because he felt it was being used by the Soviet authorities, and he's convinced the Russians use visiting delegations to spread propaganda.
This is really the great motive. If a worker goes to the Soviet Union and he is treated as a VIP and he is given all kinds of information and knowledge about progress, he can come back and he can talk about it to his fellows on the shop floor. And he then has something to elevate him among his colleagues. This is a great draw. And this draw also, to jump now onto a higher level, is something which attracts people in our universities. You see, there is a glory offered, a pseudo-glory. A writer who can be perhaps unknown in England can, if he is well thought of, if he attends these functions, if he makes the necessary contacts, especially with the Society of Cultural Relations, he can find that when he gets to the Soviet Union, his photograph is in all the schools, enlarged as the greatest living English writer. I could name a number of people whose photographs I have seen in the schools and universities all over the Soviet Union, whose names are completely unknown to the population.
So this man is flattered.
This man is flattered. He has a pseudo-glory.
This, again, all of this, in fact, is not cloak and dagger spying. It is something much more subtle and sinister. It is creating an enormous bank of goodwill, going to an enormous lot of trouble, just in the hopes of reaping one fact, maybe.
Yes, and it places the individual concerned in an anomalous situation. It places him in debt. He has a debt of gratitude to the Soviet Union for giving him some great glory, which in his own land he has never achieved.
The KGB are particularly good at this kind of moral blackmail. On a diplomatic level, they're always quick to take advantage of any built-in goodwill they happen to come across. A common technique of infiltrating agents into a country is through an official delegation. Say it arrives for a 3 or 4 day visit. With it is an agent, a chauffeur perhaps, a secretary, an interpreter. Eventually the entourage leaves, and when the security people check through the numbers, they find someone stayed behind. When challenged, the agent says with great indignation, "Why did you let me in the first place if you want to throw me out now?" The object of the exercise is simple. The British don't like a fuss. The Foreign Office particularly doesn't like a fuss. The Russians know it only too well and hope that perhaps to avoid a distasteful scene, the matter might be dropped. It's a try-on, and sometimes it works. There is another obvious disadvantage our security people have in relation to the KGB. Our men don't take part in the formation of government policy. Their men have a total say. We all know now that the KGB chief, Andropov, has a good deal more power than Mr. Gromyko, the man Sir Alec had to deal with in New York. This immense power means that the KGB can get clearance for anything at once. MI5 has to answer in the end to Parliament. But on an operational level in the war between the two security services, the British, despite their disadvantages, sometimes have some remarkable victories. This man agreed to talk about his experiences with the KGB. He's British and we'll call him Jim Walker. He's a research scientist in the field of nuclear energy, and some time ago he was at a conference. There too a party of Russians, most of them convivial, direct and friendly. He talked particularly to one Russian, a man he came to know as Victor. As the Foreign Office have revealed today, he was really Vladislav Drozdov, a Soviet diplomat.
He invited me to have lunch with him in London and to show him some of the sort of normal tourist sites of London, which I did. And during this, there was what might be said to be a preliminary testing or feeling, a few almost snide remarks about the government and affairs in the country, to which, out of politeness, I made little response, but which I think he probably took as a feeling perhaps somewhat in common with his. Within a matter of 4 meetings, spaced over perhaps 6 weeks, he then broached what I would consider to be the first technical contact point, when he said that a friend of his had the job of preparing a summary of work on some particular technical aspects of interest connected with the sort of field I was working on. And could I let him have, in fact, a short handwritten summary which he could send on to his friend. His friend was going to be paid for this job, and that, shall we say, the man I was dealing with, Victor, had been offered some money by this man to get this. And perhaps, I could help. If I couldn't, well, it didn't matter. It was a purely minor affair. And so, at about this stage, I made the sort of first overtures to our department in my organization who were concerned with security, and said, as a matter of self-protection more than anything else, I am seeing Victor's X of the Russian embassy. And it was within a matter of a fortnight following that I received a visit from a member of our security department in London. I mean, by security department, no, I mean governmental security department, who first of all questioned me very closely upon the relationships I'd had with this individual, and pointed out that I was probably very close to being recruited as a potential spy for them. He asked me whether I would be prepared to continue to see Victor and to let them know of developments and to accept direction from them. And following this, I agreed, in fact, that I would participate in this exploit.
When you'd agreed to work for British security then, and follow this case through, can you tell us in detail what the next steps were by Victor?
Well, let me describe first, I think, the 2 phases which I would identify, which is first the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period I would loosely define as the hand-holding period, when, first of all, you're assessed as to your potential corruption. I was taken to a club in London, in the vicinity of Soho, where, if I may put it in Victorian language, the delights of the flesh in all directions were exposed to my vision. Having assessed that I was unlikely to respond to this sort of stimulus, I think the next step was to assess my financial status and advantage, and to see how I could be approached best there. Then, from there, it went gradually to the stage where the transition period went to one where we were having dinners which I will say were very elaborate affairs. I mean, it was entertainment on a very grand scale. Quite frequently we'd have meals, for example, which would cost as much as £10 per head, and the entertainment was very lavish. This again, incidentally, was another bond. I happened to like good food and good wine, and he professed the same. I'm sure he enjoyed it just as much as I did. From there, he reached the stage where it had reached a business-like basis. The sort of honeymoon period was over, and it was stated that meetings were in fact a risk, and that it was then that one started the furtive business. First of all, I was trained in the use of a Minox camera, and we had a meeting in which it was explained to me that such brief meetings were even still a risk. And by this time, it was accepted by both parties that we both realized where we were. Never explicitly stated. It was never said, look, you are a spy working for the Russian embassy. But it had become very apparent, you know, in the course of activity that this is really what was happening. And I think I was seen as a pretty willing participant.
And that willingness was soon translated into action. This film, shot as it happened, shows Victor, the Soviet diplomat, collecting intelligence material from a dead letterbox after an elaborate series of instructions. The film was cut before it reached us to protect Jim Walker's identity. We have absolutely no doubt of its authenticity. We'll go through it in detail. At an agreed time, Walker puts down several rolls of Minox film at a spot he's already been told about. As he leaves, he places a copy of the Financial Times, again at an agreed spot. This tells Victor that there's something to collect, and he picks up the film. Jim Walker's never seen the film himself, but he describes the incident as he remembers it.
I would be told to proceed to this location at a certain time on a certain evening, and to leave the film in an old Heinz beans tin or something of this sort, by a certain tree, shall we say. I was to leave at a location, a certain crossroad, a sign which would indicate to the pickup person that I had left the material there. The symbol we had was in fact a copy of the Financial Times. I would then drive away and wait. The sign that they had found and had picked up the material was that the Financial Times would be moved from that location to another prescribed location. I was bending just gently to the sort of, we would like, if you could get us a little information in this area. And I would say, well, yes, I'll have to look at that, you know, of course, it must be unclassified. Yes, it will be unclassified. Of course, we only want unclassified information. And then, of course, one would refer it back to the department. The department would say, yes, provide the following. And the following went. And the next demand would be, your last amount of information was very interesting, and my friend has found this. You know, he has been able to get what he wants from his department, and he has sent me this as a gift. Now, perhaps I could give you half of this money. So it began.
How much was it?
Oh, there were small sums in general. I'm quite amused when I see the sort of sums that I see banded around. In general, I think that I received sums of between 20 and 50 pounds per aliquot. The amount of information I was handling was small and fairly innocuous in nature. Obviously, one has to be very careful about this.
Over a considerable time, you received varying sums of money. What did it amount to, and what did you do with it?
Well, I never really totted it up. It'd be pretty difficult to do that, but the money I received went over to the department, and I received a small expense coverage angle, which was, I think, fair. I mean, one shouldn't expect to gain out of this sort of field. It's, you know, something that I think that if you live in a country and you have loyalty to that country, then you can't really be expected to be paid for giving your for your country.
But did Victor get a bit upset towards the end that you weren't providing him with more
Yes,
suitable?
there were pressures. Could I try to get more in this direction? And often it was a matter of sort of simply prevaricating, saying, yes, I will try to get this. I think in the end that it had reached the stage, well, so far as I know, all that happened was that eventually it stopped. I never saw Victor again.
Though Jim Walker never knew it, it was the end of the road for Victor too. One night, not long after he'd picked up some material from yet another dead letterbox, the police were waiting. There was a short but fast car chase through the dark lanes somewhere in the home counties. There was a struggle. Victor, registered in the diplomatic list as a second secretary in the scientific and technical department of the Soviet embassy, immediately claimed diplomatic immunity. As soon as it was checked, he was released. Within 48 hours with his family, he was out of the country. But why did Victor risk the undoubted humiliation and the indignity he suffered at the hands of the police? After all, he'd nothing to fear physically. Because of his diplomatic immunity, he could only be expelled, and that doesn't mean a lot. Once a KGB man, always a KGB man. Agents do pop up again, sometimes after a period of years, in different locations, with different contacts. In fact, it's almost certainly patriotism, love of Mother Russia, that inspired Victor, as it inspires most of the men who live his kind of life. Long before the Communist Revolution, Russian attitudes to the outside world were coloured by an inferiority complex that made their officials suspicious and envious of countries that seemed more advanced than their own. Ever since Peter the Great studied shipbuilding at Gravesend docks 300 years ago, Russian ideas have been coming in from the West. Even Marxism itself was an import. The Russians also find it very difficult to understand foreigners. They regard all visitors to their country as potential spies, and even if Victor hadn't wanted to spy, he'd have been made to feel he had to, as a patriotic duty. But at the same time, they daren't let too many people go abroad, except under the closest supervision in case they defect and reveal. Obviously, all this makes them heavily dependent on Western sources they can seduce. And these days, of course, in industry alone, seduction can be a profitable business. A scientific report, for example, an industrial technique, might cost, say, £5,000 to produce. That's just about the amount it costs the Russians to keep one KGB man operating in London for a year. If he gets hold of 2 documents, he's almost certainly onto a profit. But it's a profit in strictly financial terms, not necessarily in scientific gain. As our science correspondent David Wilson points out, this type of espionage is largely out of fashion.
What the technical men, the scientists and the research men and the technologists feel about it, is this trying to steal the secret plans, is that the Russians are very largely wasting their time and their effort. And the reasons are these. Scientists on 2 sides of a barrier invariably know pretty well just what the other side is doing. The reason they know it is that they're doing it themselves. The reason they're doing it themselves is that it isn't scientists' brains that govern these things, it's the law of physics that governs the development in technical and other fields. So there are only 2 or 3 answers, possible answers to any particular question, and any competent scientist in that particular field can usually outline what the answers are. The question is, have you got the technology to make those answers work? Now, if you haven't got the technology at home, no amount of stolen plans from the other side will enable you to do it. And the second big reason is the time factor. It's really this: even if you do steal secret plans from somebody, it will take you, whatever your country, whatever your industry, on the whole, at least 5 years to get a new device into service. And of course, in that time, the scientists on both sides have developed even further things in both directions. This, in fact, I think, is the chief factor that makes at least a lot of Whitehall people feel that a lot of this spying is really just not worth the effort spent on it. Just imagine, for instance, that you were down in Bristol and you saw there the chief designer of the Concorde, and he was worrying terribly about some problem or other, something or other wouldn't work. Suddenly a little man pops in and says, "Psst, I'm from MI7 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is. I know how the Russians do it." Well, you know where the little man would be told to go and jump. I mean, it isn't just that it's psychologically impossible, it's also that it's practically impossible. Of course, even if he did bring an answer, it'd take, oh, I don't know what, 3 years probably to put that answer into the great row of Concords that's already on the production line. The fact that the Russian Tu-144, their supersonic, is remarkably like the Concorde to look at doesn't necessarily mean that there's been spying. It's much more likely to be that two teams of aircraft designers, faced with, broadly speaking, the same problems, backed by, broadly speaking, the same technology, came up with answers that were very much the same according to the laws of physics. After all, the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt 109 looked remarkably similar in a different era, but probably for exactly the same reasons. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any secrets. What I'm saying is that the secrets are very much more banal, very much less dramatic. It's a question of when the new device is coming into action, how many you can produce and what cost it's going to be, and just how are you going to use it in what sort of circumstances. These are the things that are real secrets, and it is, of course, the job of the security people to block up the channels by which these real secrets will get out.
And there is no doubt that the government's action in expelling the diplomats will help with that. No matter how big a political issue it becomes here at home, no matter how much of a diplomatic row it causes abroad, whatever people may feel about the rights and wrongs of it all, for the security services particularly, there's an immense feeling of relief. If nothing else, they've got 90 fewer people to look after. Take the Victor case. We don't know exactly how long it lasted, but certainly it was many months. The costs of supporting that operation alone with money and manpower was enormous. For every Jim Walker, for every agent in the field, at least 5 others are behind him, playing a kind of three-dimensional chess game in the dark. The situation had got to such a pitch that the security services just couldn't cope anymore. The expulsions also give them at least a reasonable chance of covering future subversive activity, and of course any future Russian agent will have to be a deal sight more careful himself. Perhaps the last word should go to the man, a private citizen, who for a short period of his life came to know a great deal about the Secret Service.
And I think that what they've done now is to pull off a sort of major triumph. They really have. The sort of quieter events, the sort of little occasions in which I was involved, these in their way are sort of triumphs, but they're going on continually, and the people put a lot of work into it, and yet there's no sort of glory at the end of it from their point of view.